All right. All right, we are back. This is Computer Science S76. So there weren't too many questions from you, so that means it's my turn to start asking questions. Last week we started talking about MVC, which, how about we'll start with the softball, stands for what? Model View Controller. Okay, so what is the controller in that acronym? Okay. Brains of the application. So it's the code that you write, the so-called business logic that governs the control of your application. It's the entry point to really the logic that you write. All right, how about the view? Yeah, so interactions with the user. So view typically deals with presentation, both the aesthetics thereof, so how you're displaying information to the user, and then it typically has some UI mechanisms like buttons and text fields and whatnot that somehow send messages back to which of the letters? The controller. So you have this bidirectional arrow essentially between your C and your V, so the two are talking, but you do not have an arrow between, say, V and M directly. Rather, the model is where you typically represent your data, and we'll do a simple example tonight of what you might want to model with its own class that we write ourselves. But typically, all of those communications should be marshaled through the so-called controller. So that's where really the intellectual property of your app tends to be. And the aesthetics are in the view, and then the model is where we'll do our data typing and our data representation and encapsulation. We'll do a bit of that in just a bit. All right, so that was MVC. And in what form does this take in the world of iOS? Well, in iOS, we have a few classes within UIKit. So this is the API that provides access to UI-related things in iOS. And UI application was a class that we barely spent any time with because we just make a reference to it in main, essentially, where we have a new UI application. And that's the class that embodies your actual application. But beyond that, we don't really need to care too much about it. But UI application delegate is a class that we spent a little more time talking about. And what is that class's role when you create an iOS app? Use it in a sentence that makes it sound like technically you're comfy with what its role is. So it's where you put your code, or at least the first entry point. You wouldn't put your code in main.m, but rather you might first put it in the UI application delegate. And conceptually, it's to this class, or an object thereof, that control of your application is delegated or passed. So he's now the guy in charge. But as soon as we started doing more interesting applications than just rectangles on the screen and started getting interactions from users, we further delegated control from the UI application delegate to an object of what type? UI view controller. And we don't have to per se. Games don't necessarily use that same class, and custom applications don't necessarily use that class. But the UI view controller is nice because it comes with a whole bunch of built-in functionality for handling various common paradigms like buttons and sliding and tabular views and so forth. So it's a common starting point, certainly for the types of menued applications we've looked at thus far. And a UI view controller, in turn, makes use of bunches of UI view objects, but typically not just generic UI view objects. What are some subclasses that we've used and talked about? Two of which I've enumerated tonight, albeit off camera. Starts with UI, ends with button. Okay, so UI buttons. So this was just a subclass. And thus far, we've essentially used these things by dragging and dropping. But we did have a quick glimpse last time at nonib.xcode project, which was a re-implementation of that super simple app that gave me a text field for my name, gave me a button to click on to actually then trigger a UI alert view saying, hello, David, or hello, such and such. And we dragged and dropped that UI button, but UI button is just a specific incarnation of UI view. And if you think back to Xcode and think back to Interface Builder, that drag and drop interface, what we're essentially doing by dragging and dropping is dropping these little objects on top of a canvas. And they can overlay, overlay, overlay. And we'll do a little more of that in a different sense tonight by actually responding to arbitrary key presses or pinches for zooms and the like. So we can actually listen to the entire UI view, as we will see. UI window, finally, was a special case of a UI view. It has some additional stuff baked into it that essentially describes the full rectangular area of the iOS device in question. But today, we'll spend a bit more time in UI view controller and UI view, but we'll see those other classes again along the way. So Let's see. So last time, we looked at a whole bunch of these templates. None of these templates are strictly necessary. You could just start with nothing in your project and start writing files by hand. The problem is you just end up reinventing the wheel. There's a lot of configuration details that we saw in the form of property lists, those key value pairs, that would just be a pain to do manually. So Xcode helps jumpstart things either with an empty application, which has the bare minimum of configuration. And then we looked at single view last time. And in lab, you looked at utility view, and you're knee-deep in a utility view application for Evil Hangman. So if we proceed a little further today, let's take a look at these two last ones. Not because they in and of themselves are applications you'll need to use for the project, but rather because they're illustrative of somewhat more complex applications that you might implement that nonetheless assume familiarity with the overall structure we had earlier. So let's do this. First, let's start somewhere simple. I'm going to go into Xcode, and I'm going to first start not with an empty application, which was super uninteresting by the end of last week, but single view application, and then we'll quickly build on from there. I'm going to go ahead and call this single view. I'm going to just store it on my desktop. I'm going to uncheck storyboards here, click next, then I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now we have the following boilerplate files. So suppose, by contrast, I didn't just create this right in front of you, but you were handed this project from someone else, and you want to wrap your mind as to what's going on inside of it. Where's the best place to start to understand what you've been handed?
In the .h file, viewcontroller.h.
Okay, viewcontroller.h. I would propose that's maybe a little too deep at first glance. Why don't we start where the beginning of the story begins? Yeah, app delegate, and really, if we want to be super anal about this, technically it's main.m that kickstarts the whole process, and a quick glance should at least reassure that there's nothing special, nothing different there, but indeed it's in this file that we see mention not only of UI application, but also app delegate, to whom we're going to delegate control. So we've confirmed that there's nothing distinct in there. So now I would propose among the app delegate files, starting with the .h is probably the better place, because it gives you, in theory, an overview of what's about to go on, and it also gives you a sense of what needs to be implemented in the .m file. So what's going on here? Well, quick recap. The import line does what for us?
It imports the user interface kit.
Okay, good. It imports the user interface kit. And what does that mean? So in that .h file, there's a whole bunch of class declarations, perhaps, maybe a bunch of constants that are defined, a whole bunch of things that we want to take for granted exist. And this is our way of teaching Xcode that we want to use the code that someone else wrote. All right, on the next line, we have @class view controller. Actually, that's a little strange. There's a semicolon, yet no implementation of the class. What is it with this line here, @class view controller, which we've not really spent time on? Yeah?
So the @class actually tells it that it is a class, but it doesn't actually import it.
Exactly.
Unless you were going to use one of its methods, that should suffice to tell it that it exists.
Exactly. So we didn't spend time on this last time, but this is what's called a forward declaration. It's a little hint to the compiler saying there is going to be a class called view controller. I'm not going to tell you anything more about it, but if you see mentions of view controller elsewhere in this file, don't complain. Don't give me any red warning saying that's not allowed. This is just teaching the compiler what's actually going to come. And indeed, where are we using that? Well, a few lines later, we're declaring a property whose purpose in life is to store a pointer to a view controller object. So this is, long story short, in a way of avoiding potential circular references whereby one file might import another, A common paradigm is if you only need to make mention of the class in this way in your .h file, just to use a forward declaration and not to import the whole viewcontroller.h file, for instance. Okay, what's this third, more interesting line saying? @interface, app delegate, UI responder, angled brackets, UI application delegate. Let's start easily. This just declares what? What's this mention in black of app delegate? Name of the class, all right? The UI responder means it's the UI responder is the parent of the class, so app delegate is going to descend from UI responder, and someone else, the UI application delegate in angled brackets? It's a protocol. So we're saying that we are going to implement the UI application delegate protocol, and this makes sense because the class, after all, is called app delegate. All right, what are the two properties? Well, we saw one view controller. We have another pointer to the UI window. That'll give us access to the full rectangular portion of the screen, and that's it. All right, so now let's dive into the M file. All of that is boilerplate. None of that is different from what we saw last week. This file is always a little overwhelming at first glance when you have all of these comments, but that just means they're not really doing anything. So let's ignore anything that's not actually doing anything functional and focus only on this first method up top named, what's the name of this method that remains? Not app delegate, so that's the class name. The name of the method is? Yeah, application did finish launching with options. So longly named method there, but what's this doing? So first it's allocating a window. It's initializing it with a frame. That's just referring to the rectangle as we keep describing it. View controller gets, so here is where we are